welcome to my channel. If you're a regular around here, welcome back. And if this is your first time, my name is Avon Van Hassel. I write fairy tale retellings from a historical fantasy perspective, and I'm also a blogger, and I'm here on YouTube every so often, the appropriate frequency, to talk about writing tips and tricks, but also some tidbits from history or historical gossip or whatever. It really depends on what's in the air at the time. Also, just a side note, my hair is doing a thing today. She's decided to have a personality, and we're just going to ignore her because every time I try to fix it, I just end up making it worse. I try to tease it and I just ended up pissing it off. So yeah, we're just gonna move on and not pay her any attention. So today we're talking about Lancelot Capability Brown. Just gonna dive right into it. Normally I don't like to do too many things that are kind of samey back to back, and I know last month I did a double biography, and this week is also a biography, but kind of not. Yes and no. So this is the continuation of my gardens series, and it just so happens that we're talking about one specific gardener this year, but I had to take the opportunity while I had it, and last month I was actually in the UK and I passed by one of his most famous gardens, and so I had to get footage while I was there. So it just seemed appropriate, and also what better time to talk about gardens than spring, and it just so happened that the installment this time happened to be more biographical than geographical. Today we are talking about Lacelot Brown, or Capability Brown as he's more famously known, and yeah, let's just dive right into it. So Lancelot Brown was born on August 30th, 1716. His mother's name was Ursula, and she was a maid, and his father's name was William, and he was a land agent at Kirkharle, I think that's how it's pronounced, in Northumbria, in service to Sir William Lorraine. Land agent is kind of like, he takes care of the actual land that the estate is built on, so that the actual lord doesn't have to do all of that. So he deals with the gardens, but also the tenant farmers and all that stuff. So the actual managing of the physical land is his job. After he got out of school, young Lancelot started working in the for the kitchen gardener at Kirkharle, and then when he was 23, he started moving around the country and kind of like doing a little piecework at different big gardens around England, where he eventually got his first solo commission at a new lake in Kiddington Park in Oxfordshire. In 1741, he went to Stowe Gardens, where he worked under William Kent, who was, up until that point, Britain's most famous gardener. If you already know who Capability Brown is, you probably already also know who William Kent is. He's now considered Britain's second most famous gardener. So the student surpassed the master pretty immediately, but they're still 1 and 2. They're still up there together. He stayed at Stowe with William Kent for about 10 years, during which time he was allowed by the Lord of Stowe, whose name was Lord Cobham, to take freelance commissions around the country. He was a really good I almost said swordsman. I hope so. He was a really good horseman, and so that enabled him to ride around the whole country pretty quickly and get things done very efficiently. So he got his nickname Capability, because he would go and assess your property and decide whether or not it had capability, which is to say natural beauty that he could enhance. He was a Virgo, which I think is important to note for my astrology girlies out there, because when you look at some examples of his gardens, then it's all going to make sense. And I'm going to explain why that was in a minute, because it's all relevant. It's not just personal taste, it kind of is, but it's also historical context as well. By the 1760s, he was already very well known all over Britain, but specifically to the crown, and he became the head gardener for Hampton Court Palace, and he was making enough money that he was actually able to buy an estate off the Earl of Northampton, and then while he was living on this estate, he was appointed the Sheriff of Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire. So he was a sheriff as well as a freelance and royal gardener. So He did okay for himself. Not too bad for the son of a maid. On February 6, 1783, after a night out, he just collapsed on the doorstep of his daughter's house and then subsequently died. So that was a shock, I'm sure. He was buried in the churchyard outside of his estate and left to his family what in today's money is roughly £6 million. So he had a pretty impressive life, pretty interesting life. So that's the short rundown. The biography aspect of this is a lot shorter than last month's. So there's a lot less. I would say he had as remarkable a life as Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, but there's a lot less to talk about. They had a lot to chew on, and of course there's two of them. So this one's much more straightforward, I guess. So when you think about an English country garden, I'm sure most of you, especially us in the States, are picturing things like hedges, like hedge mazes. You might be thinking about a rose garden. You might be thinking about like elaborate greenhouses and like conservatories and pergolas and all of those sorts of, gazebos and things with like ponds and winding walkways and maybe a little artificial forest. Like, we have all kinds of ideas of what it looks like. But a Capability Brown garden looked like this. Like, where is the garden? Is the garden in the room with us? Well, it is. Let me explain the context first. So the little story I tell in my blog post is how, like, I lived in Cardiff for 3 years. I went to Cardiff University, and I spent a lot of time in the castle. And one of the things they love talking about the castle is that it has an original Capability Brown garden. And I was like, where is this garden? Because I've been all over the grounds. I've been inside the walls. I've been to the top of the Norman Keep. I've been all inside the house, like the tea. And I've been like all over those grounds, right? I was in a reenactment society very briefly. We were all over those grounds. So like, where is the garden? Is it a secret? Is it like the area behind the castle? Like, is it the little like bus stop across the street from the castle? Like, where is the garden? And so that's when I had to really do some research on what his actual thing was. Like, what was his actual style? So you have to imagine the context, what was going on in history at the time. When you look back, especially when you think of things like Tudor gardens, you think very geometrical, right? You think of exotic plants. You think of just like a lot of fuss. There are a lot of things going on. It's very dense. There's a lot of ornamentation. You'll have statues, you'll have fountains, you'll have all kinds of that sort of thing, right? It's very resource heavy. It's very labor intensive. It's very expensive to maintain. And of course, there's a lot of land that is taken up that can't be used for farming because it's used for leisure. So that was kind of seen as the excesses of the previous age. And we were in the Enlightenment now. And so people are having a lot of conversations about man's place in nature. We're talking about religion. We're talking about science. We're talking about theology. We're talking about everything. Everybody's having all these big ideas about just shaking everything up, right? And not doing things the same way we used to. So this is the age when we start having big ideas like democracy. And there are a lot of political upheavals going on as well. So Capability Brown died before the French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars, but he would have been aware of the American Revolution. So there's just a lot going on, and there is tension brewing in Europe. It hasn't quite come to a head in France yet, but it's getting there. And so this is also the age of, you've heard of the Grand Tours, about when people used to go, rich men used to go around Europe, and they would just go on holiday basically for an extended period of time, going all around Europe, and they would write about it, and they would sketch about it, and they would bring stuff home, and just kind of feeling their oats in Europe. That wasn't super encouraged. It was getting less and less encouraged at this point, and so people were kind of staying home. This was before it was actually unsafe to travel to the mainland. But people were kind of getting more interested in what was actually happening in Britain. And so they were going on sketching holidays to the Lake District. They were going to the coast to, they were taking the waters in different places. So they were getting really in touch with the natural beauty of Britain. And so it was becoming a really patriotic time as well. People were starting to really lean into like Britishness and how it was different from the colonies, because the colonies had already set themselves apart, right? Because we declared war and declared independence and all that. And we were also separating ourselves from France and Spain and other countries that were not like Britain, right? So there is this push to not only appreciate the natural world in Britain, but to distinguish it from things that were considered European. So if you think about the gardens at Versailles, that's still that old style of ornate gardens, and we don't want to be too French, right? So Capability Brown, when he said a piece of land had capability, he meant it had natural beauty that could be enhanced and accented. So these styles of minimalist gardening is actually a garden. And if you think about it as well, it's kind of like, you know how a lot of like rich people are really into minimalism right now, and it's not like they just own less stuff. It's that the stuff has a cleaner, simpler, less embellished design. This is exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. It costs the same amount of money to upkeep a pristine lawn as it does like a hedge maze. It's still the same amount of water. It's still the same amount of work, because you can't have like a blade of grass out of place, right? It still has to be perfectly manicured. It still takes the same amount of work. So instead of shaping the hedges, you're just keeping the lawn clean. And it is still land that cannot be used for farming. It's just intentionally left as barren as possible, which is still conspicuous consumption while at the same time being under consumption in a way that only rich people can cook up. So this is what I'm saying by him being like a typical Virgo, because only a Virgo can take something that's completely unadorned and be like art. So I do think there's a sort of poetic simplicity, I guess, to a lot of Capability Brown's designs. I do enjoy that sort of just enjoying the land for what it is. You don't have to put a bunch of stuff on it. You can just enjoy this wide sweeping lawn and just appreciate it for what it is. And like a natural pond or a tree here and there. And it kind of like when you thin out some of the trees, it does make each of them stand out a bit more. I'm not arguing for deforestation. I'm speaking purely from like aesthetic standpoint. It does, you do appreciate the individual trees a bit more than if it was just like a copse, So I do understand that, and I do see it, and it is kind of, especially the motte and the keep at Cardiff Castle. It does stand out. It is very pronounced, and it does draw the eye. So it is interesting. I still prefer a bit of fuss. I do like a greenhouse with exotic plants, and I like a little forest and a stream and all of that. But I do appreciate the idea of being like, we don't need all that frilly stuff. We can just like what we have. That's okay too. So I do appreciate Capability Brown, his contribution to the world of gardening, and how he just kind of like stripped all of that away and was just like, let's just, love what you've got. And I like that. The majority of my trip to Birmingham with the Tolkien stuff and a little couple of extras are going to be mostly up on the Patreon. There is going to be some on Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, Tumblr, and in the newsletter, but it's mostly going to be on Patreon. So that is going to be at the $5 a month tier. You get to see all the behind the scenes, all the really fun goodies. And yeah, so consider that if you want a bit more goodness. And I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.